Welcome to the Faith Lutheran Church Sunday Morning Bible Study for August 7, 2011. Today we continue our discussion on Luther and the Reformation and focus on the divisions within Lutheranism based on chapter 24 and 25 of the Lutheranism 101 book. Let's listen in.
He brought me to the entrance of the court. God is giving Ezekiel a vision of the temple. And the title of the section is Abominations in the Temple. So you know bad things are happening in the temple. God's holy house where he's promised to be his place of worship in Israel. God is giving Ezekiel a vision of what is going on inside of there. And he brought me to the entrance of the court, and when I looked, behold, there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, Son of man, dig in the wall. So I dug in the wall, and behold, there was an entrance. And he said to me, Go in and see the vile abominations they are committing here. So I went in and I saw. And there engraved on the wall all around was every form of creeping things and loathsome beasts and all the idols of the house of Israel. And before them stood 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. And then he named some of those elders whose names are way too long, so I'm not going to give it a shot. Each had a censer in his hand, and the smoke of the cloud of incense went up. Then he said, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of pictures? For they say, The Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land. He said also to me, You will see greater abominations that they commit. So here's what's going on. There are idols in the temple, and the temple elders, the priests, are sacrificing and praying to these false gods because they believe the Lord has abandoned them. Well, why in the world would we talk about idols in the temple? Because we're talking about the history of Lutheranism, and these things go together. Sort of. There is a connection here. What we will see is that after Luther dies, it is not as if there are not difficult problems that arise within Lutheranism, to the point where we are today, where in many Lutheran churches, this is, by way of analogy, exactly what's happening. The gods of the culture have been brought into the temple, so to speak, and are now dictating how people live and move and act and breathe and all that kind of stuff. And so how do we get there? How does that happen? That's kind of what we're going to look at today. It's not just Lutherans who are struggling with this. Every denomination across the board is going through something like this, where the cultural ideas are trumping the Word of God. The temple, the analogy here works very well, actually, because the animals and the statues that they saw, that was the culture. That was how they made their money. That was what dictated the way people thought. So it's a nice little analogy, I think. So we must be aware of when false teachings come into the church, idolatry arises. And idolatry, God's not a fan, okay? So what we're going to do today is do a real quick run-through, I hope, of the history of Lutheranism. Stop me with any questions whenever you come up with them. And I want to kind of quickly get to the big schism in American Lutheranism that we're facing right now, and kind of Missouri Synods issues in the last couple of years. I think this stuff is wildly interesting because I'm a boring guy. So you guys might be bored to tears. However, you'll learn something. So kind of stick with me. You'll see how well we can do today. What do we need to know? We do know, I get this question all the time, why do we have different Lutheran denominations? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and we'll get to them today. If you looked in your book, if you studied the last couple sections you're supposed to read, how many denominations do we have in America? How many different Lutheran groups are there in America? Anyone see?
Yes.
I'm going to guess 3, but there's probably...
There's more than 3, yeah. 7, and it's growing by the day.
Growing again?
Yeah, there's a couple more that have just started. I forget what they're called now, because of the decisions that have been made in the ELCA. So now they've started a new one, and I wish I could remember what it was called. Who knows? All right, someone knows, not me. Here we are. You got the ELCA, which is the largest. It was the largest. That number is declining after the publication of this book. That number has declined significantly. And it's continuing to do so as congregations decide whether or not they want to stay in the ELCA based off of the decisions of the last two summers ago now. The LCMS were the second largest denomination in American Lutheranism. Then you've got Wisconsin Synod. If anyone knows anything about Wisconsin Synod, they're kind of the very conservative ones, more conservative than Missouri, which is saying something. Does anyone know what the word synod means?
Walking together.
Whoa, Don, how did you know that?
Because it's in the book.
I love it. You read. That's good. That is correct. Walking in sync with each other. Synod. Okay. Association of Free Lutheran Churches. I think there's one of those in Camarillo. I believe there's one of those in Camarillo. The Evangelical Lutheran Synod, I have no idea what that is. Church of the Lutheran Confession and the American Association of Lutheran Churches. I don't know much about any of these guys, apart from, I know a little bit about Wisconsin, but I know plenty about Missouri and plenty about the ELCA. It's interesting, they list all these schools. I should email one of these guys and find out. They don't mention, I think they put their colleges in here, and they didn't mention those aren't colleges, those are just seminaries, huh? Boy, they got a lot of seminaries. That's going to create problems. Okay, so there you go. ELCA, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and a bunch of small groups. Basically, here's how it works out. ELCA, for lack of better terms, liberal. Missouri, Wisconsin, conservative. Everyone else, we're not as liberal as the ELCA, but we're not as angry as Missouri and Wisconsin. Okay, that's kind of how it all plays out. That may be a crass way of putting it, but I guarantee if you talk to somebody in the Association of Free Lutheran Churches and you say, why aren't you in a Missouri Synod church? Well, we're nicer than them. It's probably something more than that. Women pastors or something along those lines. Okay, so here we go. Luther dies 1546. This is a problem. Anytime you have a great movement and the big leader dies, who's going to take over becomes quite an issue. In Rome, they don't have this problem. They all get to vote their new guy in with the new pope. Luther is not a pope. In fact, we are called Lutherans to our detriment. We are not followers of Luther. We are evangelicals. That is, we believe the gospel. We were the first evangelicals. We were the first to use that term, and now it's been taken from us and used by American evangelicalism, unfortunately. But Lutheranism is kind of what has stuck with us, which is fine. We'll take it. Luther wasn't a bad guy. But after Luther dies, there becomes problems. In 1546, you have these issues that arise in terms of who's going to take over the movement. And so the book talks about how Melanchthon is kind of the main guy. Do you ever remember who Philip Melanchthon is? Just off the top of your head? Big, important guy. Luther's right-hand man, wrote the Augsburg Confession, the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, and the small cult, Power and Primacy of the Pope. These are part of the Book of Concord, which we talked about last week. For that rousing discussion, go watch the YouTube video, okay? Melanchthon's kind of the main guy. He and Luther have been spearheading this thing. So it's kind of assumed that Melanchthon's going to take over as the new leader. But a problem arises. Melanchthon starts to rewrite and tweak the Augsburg Confession so that it's more approvable by Rome, and with the issues of the Lord's Supper, more easily to the Reformed can sign on to it. In other words, the Reformed and the Lutherans are having this great debate these days, and we continue to have this debate, on the Lord's Supper. What do we mean by real presence? This is the big debate among us, okay? And so Melanchthon starts to rewrite our confessional documents to make it sound like, oh, there's a little leeway here to believe pretty much anything, which is a problem, okay? Because if you don't know what's happening at the Lord's Supper, you're going to have a lot of confusion, especially if you have one church teaching one thing and another church teaching another thing and condemning what the other church is teaching, even though you're saying you're in fellowship and you're actually not. So this is a problem. Further, Melanchthon is trying to buddy up a little bit more with Rome. Melanchthon always wants to be a part of the Roman Church, I think, if they teach the doctrine of justification rightly. He's looking for peace. He's looking for unity. Melanchthon doesn't want a schism. Melanchthon wants a united church, as did Luther, but Luther finally resigned himself to saying, it's just not going to happen. The Pope has denied the gospel. We're out. Melanchthon says, there's still a chance. And so Melanchthon kind of starts to, maybe we'll make this work. I'll just tweak this here, move this around here. And suddenly, free will starts to be something we have again. And suddenly there's something we have to contribute to our salvation on some level. And suddenly the Lutherans who are remaining faithful to what they had been taught from the scriptures are freaking out. So what do? Well, a group of Lutherans referred to as the Gnesio Lutherans, Gnesio, that should be in your book, as well as in your Book of Concord, which I know you're all dying to read now. They get together and they begin to deal with the debates that are taking place within the church. Okay? There are two problems every church will always have to face. Okay? As a church body, as a congregation, whatever. Attacks from without, false teaching, false religions, the Pope, all these problems from without side of the church. But then also problems within the church. False teaching arising among the brethren, heresy, heterodox teaching. You know the difference between heresy and heterodox? Anyone know with these words I'm using? No. What does heresy mean? Anyone? If you're a heretic.
Just a false teaching?
False teaching, right. It's wrong. It denies the Trinity, for example. It denies the incarnation, something like this. It's a heresy. Heterodoxy is not heresy, but it's also not quite right. You have heretics, false teachers, orthodox, right teachers, right? And then you've got the heterodox, which are Christians with incorrect teachings that have crept into their church. Like they'll be saved, but not because they got everything right. No one's ever saved for getting everything right, but you get the point. There's some things in there. They've got the gospel, but then they've added things that aren't quite so helpful. So for example, a Baptist church that doesn't baptize babies, they have a heterodox teaching about baptism. It counters what the scriptures actually say. We're not going to say Baptists are heretics on their good days, but we are going to say that some of their teachings are dangerous and not helpful, okay? So that's what we'll call heterodoxy. Now, to be fair, Baptists would say the same about me, and they should if they really believe what they teach, okay? I'm not condemning them. I'm just saying that some of their teachings are wrong, okay? But they're not going to hell over those things. Though they're in dangerous territory, okay? So that's a heterodox teaching. So these heterodox teachings arise from within the church. And so the Gnesio Lutherans, they get together, headed up by the second Martin, we call him. His name is Martin Chemnitz. And they write what we call the Formula of Concord. Okay? The Formula of Concord is part of the Book of Concord, which we have talked about last week. And this deals with issues that have risen in the church. How do we talk about free will? How do we talk about good works as Lutherans? How are we to talk about the third use of the law, that is that the law guides the Christian life? How do we talk about the Lord's Supper? What do we believe about the descent into hell? I'm trying to remember all of them. What about things that are called adiaphora, that is, things neither commanded nor forbidden by Scripture? How do those play along? Like, for example, should we have incense in a worship service or not? Doesn't come up in Scripture, so you're kind of free to do what you want. But be careful. These are the kind of issues that sort of have arisen within the church. And so they have to figure out how to deal with them. Okay? And so they clarify it with the document known as the Formula of Concord. This gets incorporated into the other confessional documents, and by 1580, you have the entire Book of Concord presented to the Diet of Augsburg, that is the gathering of the leaders in Germany, essentially. And over 8,000 people sign on to this defining document of Lutheranism. If you want to understand Lutheranism, read the Book of Concord. That's where we're at. That's what we teach. We don't follow Luther, we follow the Scriptures, and the Scriptures are explicated properly by the Book of Concord. Luther's not always right. Okay, now that's an important point that I want you to hold on to. Are you going to follow Luther, or are you going to follow the Book of Concord? And this question, on some level, I think shapes much of the debate in what we're seeing today in modern Lutheranism. Okay? We'll get there. All right. That was a lot of years in a short amount of time. I'm hopeful at this point. So everything's good. Book of Concord. You know what Concord means? Peace. It's a book of peace. It's a book of unity. This is why every single institution in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is called Concordia, because we're based off of the Book of Concord, and we have unity within our college system and seminaries. Concordia St. Louis, Concordia Fort Wayne, Concordia Colleges, Concordia Publishing House. we have no creativity, but we have concord. So that's very good. And so you have the Book of Concord. This all comes out. Everything is great. Right? Wrong. 1618 comes along, roughly 40 years after the Book of Concord is signed. And what do we have but the 30 Years' War? Many people will tell you the 30 Years' War is a religious war. This was in your book, too. And to a point it was. You can't just sort of say religion had nothing to do with it. It had a lot to do with it. However, when the King of France or something like this signs, who's clearly Catholic, the French are always Catholic, sides with the Protestants to help gain more territory for himself. This whole war of religion kind of is out the window. To an extent. So you have this 30 Years' War, and the 30 Years' War was awful. Thousands, millions of people killed. Helps bring about, if I understand my history right, I hope I'm getting this correct, this is partially responsible for what is known as the Black Plague that comes later on. You know, you go into a city, and sitting outside of the city, they have dead bodies on crosses or whatever to say, if you're going to disobey the rules here, here's what's going to happen to you. And you know what lives inside those bodies? Rats, who then leave because they're hungry and run into homes and eat your food, and then you eat that food, and that's not on the pyramid of diet stuff, food shared with rats. One time when I was in seminary, we lived in this house above a garage, and we had mice in our house, and they got into our food. And one time I was eating a fruit bar. I took a bite. I'm like, this is good. And as I took my second bite, I looked, and the wrapper had been nibbled on, and I was sick for a week and a half after that because I shared it with a mouse. Luckily, that mouse did not have the Black Plague. But so this was bad. I mean, things went really bad in Europe after the 30 Years' War. You finally have peace, but then among the religious people, they begin to say, this was a war over doctrine. Doctrine divides in a remarkably dangerous way. Maybe there's something more to religion than just teaching. And so we have something that begins, there's sort of a movement away from orthodoxy. Within Lutheranism, you have orthodoxy, and we have some great theologians who come out of that era. But you start to move away from orthodoxy, and by the time you get to the 18th and 19th centuries, you start to deal with two issues. One is called pietism. I'll write these down for you. And the other one is called rationalism. Didn't work. Pietism. Okay, pietism and rationalism. These also become very important for us. Pietism, there's a couple of guys, one guy in particular named Philip Jacob Spener. I think that's right. Philip Jacob Spener, Jacob Philip Spener, Spener, let's go with the last name, who comes along and says, real true religion is not doctrine, but it's in the heart. It's what you believe that makes religion true. Essentially, this is what he's saying. And so what really matters, this is probably a better way of doing it, what really matters is not what you believe so much as what you believe making a change in your life. So a changed life is the thing. No more of this head religion. We want heart religion. Have you ever heard something like this before? If you've ever watched anything Christian or American evangelical, this is the guiding idea, isn't it? That it's the heart that matters. Not so much what you believe, so much as what you feel, that God is making a change in your life. Now, the belief is important, but it's a means to an end. Believing leads to a changed life. And so what happens then in pietism is they're saying, look, clearly doctrine has led to war, so what we need to do is to create a better world. And we're going to do that by emphasizing less the doctrine and emphasizing more the holy living. After all, Christians are to be doing good works, aren't they? We're to be good people, aren't we? Therefore, that's the main thing. And they begin to emphasize holy living. This creates... I watched a whole bunch of stuff on this week. A buddy of mine in college gave some talks on this, and one of the things he said was, with pietism, you'll notice 4 major tenets. The head versus the heart. It's not what's up here that matters, it's what's in here that matters. It's all Hallmark, okay? It's a Hallmark. Small groups, we may not call them that, maybe more, they were called conventicles. The idea here was you have the church at large, but within the church you have the true Christians. You have the carnal Christians on the outside, those guys who say they're Christian and go to church, but, they still smoke. And then you got the guys on the inside who truly want to give their lives to Jesus and commit everything to Jesus. And so you have this, what is known as sort of a church within the church. And if you're living a certain way and doing certain things, this actually ironically produces something called Methodism. If you've heard of the Methodists, the idea there's a method to holiness. This is how you live. The truly holy are going to have these changed lives. Okay. Then you have what is known as post-millennialism. This is a big word. The idea that our holy living is going to bring about the kingdom of God. If we just get everything right and start living as holy people, then Christ will return after the millennium. This was a big, big teaching in the era of America, Manifest Destiny. We've come to America to create this city on a hill, and there's a lot of post-millennialism there that we're going to create a heaven on earth over here.
Yeah, look what we've done.
What's that?
Look what we've done.
Yeah, and so now, look at what we've done. That's why post-millennialism isn't popular anymore, because clearly it hasn't panned out. Now we're either saying Jesus is going to come back right away, which is what the Bible teaches, or premillennialists that it's going to get worse, but we're going to be raptured out of it, so don't worry about it. Okay. And then the last thing they say is that Luther's Reformation doesn't go far enough. Luther was a reformation of creeds. Now we need to do a reformation of deeds. A certain pastor who is very purpose-driven has suggested this once again lately. And you hear that, and he's thinking he's being very innovative, but this is all the way back to the 17th century. 17th, 18th century stuff. Creeds, not deeds. What's the problem with this? Why is this dangerous? Being good people. What's dangerous about being good people?
It's more about
Doesn't get
works.
you there.
It's more about works, huh?
It's what we do.
It's all about our living, right? And in fact, see, this is something that that Luther and the Reformers were really trying to fight against. Not against good works. In fact, when you read the confessions and you read the writings, they're all about good works, just in the proper place. These people are saying your assurance is found in how holy you are. Your place in the church before God is defined by your holiness. And Luther, that was the very thing the Reformers were fighting against. So it becomes more subjective, how am I living, and less objective, what does God say to me about my salvation? Remarkably, it does the exact same thing that Rome does, just without the pomp and circumstance. It's the exact same thing. And this is the danger we're looking at now in American evangelicalism, is that, it's the most popular stuff to read right now is becoming like Spainer's works. These pietists, there's a historian recently who suggested that the most influential group on American Christianity was not the Puritans. Everyone's always said it's the Puritans. But it was actually the Lutheran pietists. And if you listen to what the pietists say and then you read what you hear now, this is what we're getting. This is very important stuff. I know it sounds wildly boring, but it actually kind of matters because what really matters, you're going to hear this, what really matters is a changed life. Sylvia thinks it's hilarious, apparently. I'm kidding. So you have this. The heart is the main thing. All right, so that's pietism. All right. On the other side of this, and then especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, you have something called rationalism that arises. Rationalism, the Enlightenment, comes from a bunch of guys who are kids of pietist pastors. Okay. German Lutheran pastors' children become godless philosophers. That's why I brought Mark up front this morning, so he knows how wonderful it is to believe and see the people of God. Rationalism comes and says, don't get into touchy-feely stuff. It's the head that's important, and the end of man is what we know. So we've all heard the phrase, I think, therefore I am. What is our ground of knowledge in the phrase, I think, therefore I am? Thinking, knowledge, the person themselves. And so what happens in rationalism is science becomes the end of truth, the decider of truth. And if we can't figure it out through science, then it must not be true. If you've ever heard the phrase the God of the gaps, this kind of comes up in this time. As if we can explain it, figure it out, we can scientifically manhandle it. The stuff we can't figure out, where suns come from and all that, God's in charge of that. That's God's stuff. But once we can scientifically define it, we need God less and less. And so rationalism begins to take over, okay? And this is actually what shapes much of what we have today, again, like in the schools, where you can't talk about a potential design, or even if it's just intelligent design, you can't bring God into the schools, but you can teach evolution, because it's rational, so to speak. Does that make sense? You get a guy come along like Immanuel Kant. David Hume is a philosopher, and Hume says that resurrections can't happen because we've never observed one. So Jesus is great for moral teaching, but all that miracle stuff, we don't see miracles a whole lot. Therefore, you can't argue cause and effect for things you have no idea what causes them. You can't do that. Ironically, that guy played pool, where the whole thing is based off of what you've seen. Well, anyways, that doesn't mean so you have Hume, and then from Hume has a student named Kant. Kant also has a dad who's a pietistic pastor. The thing with pietism is it's a hard religion to pass on, because it's all based off of your personal experience, and you have to force your kids to have a personal experience. And your kids get so tired of trying to have personal experiences that they just abandon the faith altogether, right? So you have Kant, who comes along, who one of my professors at seminary told us he would, in his writings, just deny miracles, deny this stuff left and right, and then on Sunday be in church taking communion. Really interesting stuff. Because it's probably his pietism was so drilled into him, he was scared not to go. But Kant is sort of the big boogeyman in all of this, and he comes along and says, the only thing religion is good for is morals. Miracles, we have no need for them. You can see how that comes out of pietism. Because if pietism is all about our changed lives, then what God has done miraculously becomes less and less important. So you get a guy who's just completely burnt out on trying to have a spiritual experience, but retains that idea that morals are good. And then you get rationalism, and that's sort of where we're at now. So, very important stuff to keep in mind, okay? Now, amidst all of this, we found America, all right? And so Lutherans have started to come to America, and the very first Lutheran settlers in America don't have pastors. They just gather together, and they start having to get sort of work with the Reformed, even though they don't really want to, but they want someone to preach to them, right? So they start meeting together. So a university in Germany known as Halle, like the bread, though probably spelled differently, Halle, is a pietist seminary. They send a guy over named Muhlenberg, okay? Muhlenberg is probably one of the most important figures in American Lutheranism. He is the one he's sort of the first pastor who comes over, kind of helps set up a lot of important stuff. His sons become important in American history just in general. One of his sons is a colonel under George Washington and fights like in major battles in the Revolutionary War. And his other son is like the first Speaker of the House or something like this. And is famous for saying, until we stop speaking German in America, we're not going to go anywhere, or something along those lines. He also was one of the first signers of the Declaration of Independence. So Muhlenberg has he's significant not just to Lutheranism, but his kids, kind of important guys for our country. So he's a pietist. He comes over and kind of starts schools, all of this stuff he gets going on the West Coast. During this time, another guy named Martin Stephan also comes from the same school. This is a little bit after Muhlenberg, and he sets up, this is in the 1800s now, so a long time after Muhlenberg, he sets up churches in Perry County, Missouri. Everyone heard of Perry County, Missouri? No. Well, you have now, birthplace of Missouri Synod Lutheranism. Stephan sets up churches over there. Stephan is an interesting character. He's a pietist, so he's big on, conventicles and holiness and all this, but he's also very strict in terms of top-down, Herr Pastor kind of ministry. He's the leader. He's going to talk about the pastoral office almost being sacramental, which is not necessarily false. We do believe Jesus gave the church the office of the ministry to deliver the goods of forgiveness and so on. But we don't believe then that the pastor himself is a sacrament. Stephan started going there, started playing these power games. He was the one in charge. And as so often happens with people who play power games, he got caught up in a sex scandal. Stephan is accused of sleeping with a couple of the younger ladies there. It's actually quite a scandalous story because it looks, they decide this is what's happened. These girls come forward and say, yeah, he violated us. So what do? So C.F.W. Walther, who becomes the first president of the Missouri Synod, and his brother and some other guy, they get together and they're like, all right, we got to get rid of Stephan. So they put him on a boat on the Mississippi River, push him over to the other side of the river. See ya. Then he stops and they're still waving. They still see him. And so Stephan sets up his own church over there, I guess. I don't really remember what happens to him. But then Walther becomes the leader. Now, the funny thing about the story is there's actually, you look at the records, and it's all kind of shady. You can't tell if it really happened or if they're just like, we can't have this guy anymore, so we need something to get rid of him. And it's a little bizarre. Thus begins the Missouri Synod. Someone did a study on the way children in a family where parents have divorced over sexual infidelity. There's been a lot of studies on how kids in those families treat one another. And then they did the same study with the Missouri Synod because we kind of got started through this scandalous affair. And it's remarkable how we treat one another in the exact same way, where you've got, and I don't want to stereotype too much here, but you've got on the one hand people who are dead set on what's right and wrong and no one can question what they do. Then you've got someone who's doing, whatever the heck they want, and no one's going to say what about it. They're just going to have fun and be merry. And those two don't get along, but you've got the one in the middle who's just terrified that nothing's going to work, and so they're doing their best to be the glue and hold everything together. And it's really quite interesting. I mean, you sit at a synodical convention. I read this study, or heard about this study, and then I sit at a synodical convention, and I just watch it happen before my eyes. One guy stands up and says, you're all heretics because you're denying Article 3.264 of the Constitution, and then someone else stands up and says, who needs a Constitution anyways? And then someone else stands up and is crying because we're all fighting. I mean, it's amazing. It's like Thanksgiving dinner. It's quite remarkable. So Walther comes along. Walther starts off, he's a pietist. One year he gets really super sick, is homebound for a long time, and while he's homebound, he just devours Luther and leaves his pietism, though remnants of it stick around. And he becomes a very wise pastor in the Missouri Synod, and he becomes our first president. While he becomes president, one of the things we notice in a lot of American Lutheranism is a big backstory is ecumenicism, that is, churches working together, the ecumenical movement, all churches working together. And Lutherans constantly trying to form one body in America. So you have, in Walther's day, something called the General Council, and then later on the General Synod. You may want to switch those. I don't know the stuff that well. And there's all these different organizations, Lutheran churches, the Synod of Ohio and the Synod of Tennessee and the East Coasters and the English Synod all getting together and deciding we're going to be united with one another. So Walther, they invite Missouri. And Walther's like, well, sure, insofar as long as we can all agree that the Book of Concord is the right understanding of the Word of God. And they'll say, well, there's a lot of debate about that. Some of us say it's pretty helpful. Some of us say it's theologically accurate, but historically not so helpful. Some of us say this, some of us say that. And they all kind of waver on it. So Walther, and then also Wisconsin Synod guys are going to do this too. Walther in Missouri, even to this day, will say, we cannot be in unity with you because you don't subscribe fully to the Book of Concord. Now, what's the point in this? Well, by subscribing fully to the Book of Concord, ultimately what you're saying is there's an authority higher than us that we're binding ourselves to. Beyond that, then, we're going to also teach that because we're bound to the Book of Concord teaches that the Word of God is our sole norm and rule of faith. So everything goes back to the Bible, right? And if you're wavering on the Book of Concord, Walther and his guys are going to say, there's going to be a chance that later on down the road, you may make that move with the Bible. Now we may say that's overreacting. Welcome to 2011, where this is actually, going on. So, this becomes very interesting. This is a very brief overview. I mean, if you study this more in depth, it's going to be a little more nuanced than what I'm saying, but that's okay. I actually don't think you'll ever think about this again. Okay, they set up the Missouri Synod. One of the fun things about the Missouri Synod is there's all these rules, things that will never ever change in the Missouri Synod. We will always subscribe to the Book of Concord. We will always hold to the Word of God. We will always teach that justification is by faith alone, through grace alone, on account of Christ alone. We will always speak German. We will always, and you're like, wait a minute, what? Always speak German, yeah, until World War I, and the Germans aren't so popular anymore, and then we kind of have to start changing. In fact, it is interesting. In Nebraska, there was they decided in Nebraska that German was illegal during the World Wars. And you could not teach in German, and the Missouri Synod took them to court and actually won, saying it's okay to speak in German, though obviously we're not doing that stuff anymore. If you ever get to see some of the writings, though, the letters they use are really pretty cool. The writing is quite amazing, and I've got some of that stuff in my office, but we don't speak that anymore, and that's fine.
Most of us.
Right. Well, Dawn and my wife. All right. So all of this stuff is going on. Suddenly, all these denominations start showing up. You have a bunch of differences. You got Norwegians and Swedes and Germans and Scandinavians. Well, I guess that'd be Norwegians and Swedes. And the Dutch and Russian Lutherans and all these Lutherans getting together and trying to figure out how can we be united. Okay. During this time, Lutheranism in Germany, okay, maybe we may talk about this a little bit next week. During this time, Lutheranism in Germany is moving out of rationalism, but, or maybe better said this way, rationalism has begun to creep into theology classes, or it's been there for a while. And what happens is that reason begins to dictate how people read the Bible. So miracles, not so sure what to do with all of those. Is the Old Testament reliable? Maybe it was written by a bunch of different people. Maybe Moses didn't write the books of Moses. You know, and all these big questions start to come up. If you've been in Crossways, we've gone through some of this. It's called the historical critical method. It begins to arise in Germany. Further, they begin to teach something in Germany known as gospel reductionism. That is, there's no need for a law anymore for Christians. It's all that matters is the gospel. And this is interesting stuff. Well, suddenly the Missouri Synod wants to sort of become more academically respectable, which isn't a bad thing. And so they start sending their professors over to study under these guys teaching historical critical method and gospel reductionism. They send them over to Germany to study underneath them. So they can, and there's some great theologians in this era who teach a lot of dangerous stuff, ultimately. So they send our guys over there, and our guys study under them, and they start to bring this European theology back to America and start teaching it in St. Louis. And this becomes very problematic. And this is, we'll go and do this next week. I mean, we don't want to get into all this today. This actually gets quite interesting. This is where that Ezekiel stuff starts to happen. Baal's been let into the temple. And suddenly rationalism begins to dictate the way we think. And liberalism begins to dictate the way we preach. And it becomes very quite interesting. Go ahead, Jeff.
I just want to ask you a comment that's not really related to that.
Okay.
What do you think what's going on with the governor of Texas and his big prayer that he had?
Who's the governor of Texas?
He's running Perry.
Okay. What did he do? I don't know.
He had this big, massive prayer, 30,000, thing, kind of related to his political thing. You haven't seen it?
I haven't heard it. No, I don't watch the news. Was it on Facebook? Because if not,
I don't know anything about Facebook.
Stay that way. I don't know.
No, it's on the news. It's just it's a huge thing going on.
What did he pray?
It's a big thing going on between politics and
religion.
Religion.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen it?
No, well, I've heard about it. I haven't. Not
So,
in detail, though.
so the fact that he prayed, this is the controversy?
He made this great big prayer, and he's going to be running for president, and it's just, it's a big thing in our country right now.
He's not going to win, then.
Actually, they're saying he's leading the poll. He's ahead of Mitt Romney. I mean, like
That doesn't mean anything.
I know this.
I don't know. Do I think? I hope our presidents pray.
No, but in a big. I mean, I don't know. It's just a big, Texas.
He's not separating church and state.
No, and that's what all these big religious people are are talking about.
Depends on where he is. So if he's at a rally of Christians and wants to pray, I'm fine with it. I think we should all be fine with it.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong with someone praying in public, regardless of who they are. Does he need to then, if he gets up and says, and now I'm going to force everyone else to do this, now I've got a problem.
Yeah.
I don't think that's okay. I mean, look, have you ever seen a presidential inauguration? What one presidential inauguration has there not been a Christian pastor praying at? I don't think there's been one. I mean, Obama had Rick Warren, right? So I mean, you can't kind of say, oh, we should just ban prayer from the public. In public figures should never pray in public. Well, I don't know. If it's a rally, political rally, that's a little dicey. If it's a Christian gathering,
But that's what the big debate is. That he's you know, it is a kind of a springboard to his political rally. You know, I don't know.
my concern would be, is he using this as a means of getting votes? For me, I would say, if you're going to pray to get votes, you have a lot of stuff to answer for, because that's not what it's for. I don't know. I guess I just don't have a huge problem with it given the circumstance. I don't know the circumstances and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Separation of church and state is an interesting issue. The separation of church and state is not about the church having nothing to say to the government so much as it is about the government having nothing to say to the church. You know that, right?
Is that what it is?
Yeah, it's the other. We complain about it. We need freedom from religion. That's not what it says. What it says is that the government will not be able to tell you how to worship. I believe that's the freedom of religion thing.
It's not saying that.
The church can't be involved in government.
Yeah, it doesn't say that at all. I mean, we're
They
not.
did that in Los Angeles.
What's that?
They did that in Los Angeles when they took the seal that said God is, what was it? They took the cross off
Mm-hmm.
the seal of Los Angeles because they didn't want religion.
Yeah.
It was cheaper to do that than fight the lawsuit that the person brought.
There's a guy, though his name is Stanley Fish. He writes in the New York Times. He's really an interesting guy. He suggests that maybe for Christians we should be happy about that. That when they take down crosses and stuff like that, they'll say things like, but this is a symbol of our nation, and he'll say, then you don't understand your own symbols, because it's not a symbol for your nation. It means something else. And that's an interesting argument. I don't know. That stuff always confuses me. I have no problem with a president or a governor turning to a pastor and saying, I need prayer and I need advice. I have a problem with the president or a governor or a mayor saying, this is how we will worship in this country. And I think there's a difference. I want Christian presidents. Although if he's Muslim and really good, I'm fine with that too. Luther was once credited for saying that. He never did. But what you want is someone who's going to do a good job, but also who recognizes that they are under God. It's not like there's a different God in charge of the world than over the church. It's the same God. He's running things differently. And so we hope our presidents pray. We hope our presidents seek the Lord. But if you're going to do it to get votes, that's ridiculous. That's a personal sin, though. That's more than just.
I mean, if you watch the thing, you're gonna it kind of rubbed me wrong. Just, I mean, it just this.
I'll look it up.
Public display. Nobody's seen it.
I'll look it up. I'm more concerned about the pastor at the NASCAR rally. I don't know if you guys saw that one, where he prayed. He thanked Jesus for his smoking hot wife. And,
Really?
Thank you for giving us a spectacle. And people are like cheering for
Wasn't
his.
he quoting a movie though?
Was he?
That's a quote from a movie.
Was he quoting Talladega Nights? Please
Yes.
tell me he was quoting Talladega
Yes,
Nights.
he was.
That makes it worse.
Dear baby Jesus.
Yeah, dear
Smoking hot
baby
wine.
Jesus,
Yeah, that's the
yeah.
Talladega Nights.
Yeah.
That's right. I forgot that line. Yeah. That's,
Talladega Nights.
The Legend of Ricky Bobby.
The Legend of
Really
Ricky
funny.
Bobby. No need
That is
to
funny.
watch that movie because we certainly will never recommend that in a Bible class.
It's really funny. Talladega Nights.
So Sylvia, you've seen that movie, but you haven't seen Zoolander?
Yeah. It was on an airplane. I had no choice.
No!
Just
I'm writing a letter to the airplane. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
just
Did you pay the $4 for the?
no, it was free. It
Oh,
was free.
okay.
All right. All right, I do want to talk a little bit next week. I know this is kind of dry stuff. I do want to talk a little bit next week kind of about the last 40, 50 years in Lutheranism in a Missouri Synod. I think it matters. I really do. And so don't not come because of the topic. This stuff I actually think is somewhat interesting. And if this wasn't interesting to you today, I apologize. But I understand. The next week, though, we can kind of see how this stuff starts to play out in our own cultural situation, and we can understand why Missouri and the ELCA cannot be in fellowship with each other. And these are actually very important topics. I don't know if the governor of Texas is Lutheran or not. I know the governor of Arizona is, and she's under fire all the time.
She's what?
Missouri Synod Lutheran.
Oh, she is?
Yeah, she's under fire all the time. But that's what we need, you guys, is more Lutherans in government. So raise your kids to be in government. All right, thanks for putting up with this.
For more information on Faith Lutheran Church of Moore Park, California, and for more podcast episodes like this one, visit us on the web at www.faithmorepark.com.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.